Actors are very superstitious. On no account mention the word Macbeth this evening, all right?
Why not?
It brings them bad luck and it makes them very unhappy.
Oh, so you won't be mentioning it either?
No. Well, not very often.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. Many of the customs and conventions in our modern world are rooted in age-old superstitions. A book by today's guest explains how these curious practices have stayed with us, even as their original meanings have disappeared.
We're delighted to talk with Arie Kaplan, a prolific writer of nonfiction, television, graphic novels, video games, and transmedia. His new book is The Encyclopedia of Curious Rituals and Superstitions. Arie, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you, Joey. Hey, great to be here, guys.
So I know you start off with a dictionary definition, but how would you define superstition?
I'd say that this superstition in general is when you take something that either is going to happen to you in the future, might happen to you, or has happened in the past, and you attribute its chances of success or failure to supernatural means. I'd say that's the broadest definition of it as possible.
Would you say that most people are superstitious to some extent?
I think so, and that's one of my biggest takeaways from writing the book, because what I realized, first of all, there were a lot of studies that I did research on, which showed that a huge percentage of the population of various countries are superstitious, but also the fact that a lot of our rituals and customs from everyday life that we don't think of as being based on superstition or based on anything in the occult, anything supernatural, they really are. They really did start out as superstitions, and now we do them because it's what you do. A lot of our rituals that have to do with weddings, with different holidays, that we don't think of them as superstitious at all. We don't do them for good luck or to ward away bad luck, but that's the way they started.
I think one of those things that you're referring to is knocking on wood, which apparently comes from the Druids.
There's a couple of possible origins to that. One of them is, yes, the Druids, where they believed that fairies lived in trees. And so you would knock on the wood of the tree to sort of wake up the fairies and have them give you good luck or have them ward away bad luck. The other possible origin story for knocking on wood is that in ancient times they would knock on wood because it symbolized the wood that the cross was made on, the cross that Jesus Christ died on. And so it was thought that wood had like holy connotations or supernatural connotations for that reason. And so that's why you would knock on wood, again, to ward off bad luck.
Yeah, I think that's just a gesture that people do as a gesture, like waving or shaking hands or something, without even maybe realizing that it is so superstitious.
Perhaps, although I did have a friend in college who knocked on wood. I had a couple of friends who just knocked on wood, like whenever they wanted to make sure that they didn't accidentally damn someone to bad luck with what they've just said, they would just start furiously knocking on wood. And so I've definitely known people who absolutely believe in the superstitious intent of that ritual. But yeah, some people you'll just say in casual conversation, "Hey, I hope that I get that job tomorrow, knock on wood." You know what I mean? So. And if you say that, you don't necessarily believe in it superstitiously.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
I was intrigued to learn that the birthday cake has superstitious roots. Could you explain?
Okay, so in ancient Greece, they would put candles on a cake because, not for birthdays, but because it would symbolize Artemis, the god of the moon. Fast forward hundreds and hundreds of years later, in I believe the 1700s, the 18th century, in Germany, they would put candles on a birthday cake. And not because it symbolized the moon, but because it was a way to wish you good luck for the next year, especially for children. And the idea is that if you put the candles on the cake and the child blew out the candles, then they would live for another year at least. And you have to also understand that in those days, the child mortality rate and infant mortality rate was much higher. And so a lot of superstitions that have to do with kids and with keeping children safe is just because a lot of people didn't know what a germ was in those days. And so kids would get mysteriously sick and die. And in a lot of communities, they had that this would happen for no rhyme or reason. Well, I guess it's evil forces at work. It's demons, it's ghosts, it's something, you know what I mean? And so that's where some of these superstitions came from. And this, I think, is one of them, definitely. And so then when German immigrants came to America, came to other countries, they brought this tradition with them, and that's how it spread, the idea of this birthday cake and blowing out the candles.
Yeah, when I read that, I thought two things. One, like square or rectangular birthday cakes are fraudulent. They have to be circular because they're supposed to be connected to the moon in some distant way. And the other is that I think that by and large, origins of superstitions are practical in the sense of, representing real anxieties, real aspirations, real things. And without like a direct way to kind of pin those on something, we just invent stuff.
Well, you just touched on something that is actually one of the big points I make in the book, and it's not something I knew when I set out to write the book in the first place, but it's definitely something my research taught me because I thought, the prior book that I had done for the same publisher, Quarto, was a book called The Encyclopedia of Epic Myths and Legends. And one of the first chapters in that book is about the psychological reason that we, humanity, the human race, all these different societies, conjure up myths and legends and folk tales. Why do we feel a need to do this? And so I felt like it was really important to do the same thing for superstitions. But it was a tougher thing to research because there hasn't been as much written about it. And you have to go a bit deeper. But I think I successfully did it in the book. And basically, what I found is just like you said, it's a way to confront and, I guess, conquer our anxieties. It's a way to, you have to understand that in a lot of these cultures, superstitions, and in a lot of cultures, most of the cultures on the earth, superstitions were first created when there was no such thing as modern medical science. And so things would happen to people and they would just attribute them to random chance. And that would make them incredibly anxious and nervous. And it just seemed like life is cheap and you don't know what's going to happen to you when you walk out the door. And, maybe a neighboring tribe or a neighboring culture or community is going to declare war on you. And, or some mysterious disease will spread throughout the town. You don't know what's going to happen. So this is a way of asserting some sort of control over that, of like sort of evening the odds a little bit, of saying, well, if nothing else, I feel safer because I have done this superstitious thing and I have warded off, hopefully, bad luck. I have kept the forces of evil at bay, hopefully. It's a way of kind of controlling that.
Speaking of thresholds and going through doors and so forth, of course, the mezuzah is a very classic apotropaic, warding off evil kind of magical object that, again, people use decoratively and maybe see as a sign of Jewish identity, but it's so rooted in this superstitious belief that we need to control the world around us.
It is, although I would say that I don't know that a lot of people consider it a superstition just because it's got a Torah scroll inside of it. And so then where is the dividing line between superstition and spirituality? But they are, like you said, they are really connected anyway in a lot of cultures, and Judaism is definitely one of them.
Yeah, I'd argue that praying is a form of superstition as well.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I got into trouble with when I went to a parochial Jewish school. I went to a sort of conservadox Jewish school, day school in Baltimore, Maryland, and I really pissed off one of my most of the teachers were rabbis. And one of them, I just said, look, all this stuff we're learning about in the Torah is just, you know, Moses is turning a staff into a snake, and that's magic, right? And he's like, no, it's not magic. And I said, well, yeah, it is. And also, saying a prayer those are magic words, right? This is magic. And he's like, no, it's not And I realized what was upsetting him was that I was baked to him. Magic is, a guy in a top, or a woman in a non-binary person in a top hat, and they pull a rabbit out of the hat, and they're a cheap entertainment. You know what I mean? And so I'm reducing Judaism to him to cheap entertainment. But I meant magic as in the sort of the classical sense, like the way it was used in the ancient world, kind of as like a synonym for magical forces at work. You know what I mean? Forces beyond our realm and the supernatural. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, yeah, like you said, that there is something superstitious about saying a blessing, saying a bracha. You're trying to do the same thing that you're doing with a lot of these other superstitions. I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, and if we look at the origins of blessings, certainly with, I don't want to go too down the historical road, but like Babylonian prayer bowls and other things that have been found in Jewish communities of the ancient world, these blessings were not just, gratitude expressions or anything like that. It was really a way to bring the divine power under your control to some extent so that you can use it for good and ward off evil and that sort of stuff.
And there's also something else that's very common in Jewish communities, and I didn't even know the significance of this when I was a kid, but Hamsa symbols. I have a couple in my apartment here, not in this area, so you can't see it right now. And my parents did when they were growing up. My mom owns Hamsa necklaces, and she has Hamsa amulets on the walls. I would call them amulets. My wife and I were wondering, and she was like, "Would you call it an amulet, really?" And I said, "Well, what other word is there for it? It's an amulet to me." You know what I mean? So that's what I call it in the book, just to give it like some kind of categorization that's concrete. But that's the exact same thing. It's to promote good luck and ward off bad luck. And not just in Judaism, in a lot of Muslim communities as well. So, and it's very common. And what's funny is even after I wrote the book, every time we go on vacation, my wife and daughter and I see someone selling evil eye amulets somewhere. And evil eye amulets are very connected to Hamsa amulets as well. There's a lot of evil eye superstitions in the Jewish community as well.
I'm thinking maybe we should talk a little bit more about Judaism because, it's kind of a Jewish thing to feel like we're not superstitious, and yet we seem like we kind of deeply are. And I think that's like pretty much everybody, and you also mentioned early in the book, Israel's population is like 93% superstitious based on a survey.
Yeah, it's 997, I think, something like that. And what a lot of scientists have found is that the numbers go up by a huge margin when you take into account people who don't consider themselves superstitious, but then when you ask them questions that show that they actually are. When it's just people who identify as superstitious, the numbers are like 40%, 50%. But when you go up to, well, do you do this for good luck? Do you do that for to ward away bad luck? And people are, oh yeah, actually, I guess if they do that, then the numbers just skyrocket, and then suddenly it's like 94%, 95% of people in a certain country or community. And so yeah, it definitely. You have to keep that in mind. You have to take that into account.
I'd like also to say a little aside for the time I spent living in Korea, which was 1 year. You mentioned fan death, and I talked with some of the young people who were pretty skeptical about it. When, you have a fan running in your room, there has to be a window open. And some people had said like they had like attempted to do it, like either as a way of attempting suicide or just to test it out and stuff like that. So it was sort of tongue in cheek, but it's still sort of pervasive. Also, one time I was writing a kid's name in red marker and everybody was aghast and they said, "You can't do that. That symbolizes death." And the last one I thought was very interesting, maybe even pseudoscientific, was whenever it rained, umbrellas were very prevalent because they believed that all rain was acid rain. And if you had your head uncovered, you would go bald. And so I'm wondering, like, where is that weird superstition into pseudoscience borderline there? Because Again, I wouldn't have said that to a Korean person because it feels a little derisive to say it's superstitious, but all three of those things have those kind of varying degrees of sanctity and very seriousness about practicing.
Well, fan death is very, it is fairly common in a lot of Korean communities. I talk about that in the book too. And apparently, there's a lot of millennials who are now adults, who were kids when at the height of the fan death superstition of its popularity. And they very much remember their parents kind of freaking out if they had a fan in the room and the window was closed, for that same reason it could, something horrible could happen to you. But apparently that superstition is not as popular anymore, but if you were growing up in the 80s and 90s, it very much was. Or if you were a kid in the 80s and 90s, it very much was, if you had a parent in those days. And I don't know why. I don't know why some of these superstitions ebb and flow. I don't know why some of them are generational, you know, uh, but that definitely does seem to be the case.
I would almost say that one has sort of the weight of an urban myth because I remember people saying that they had heard stories of people who had died that way and nobody really knew how to attribute the stories. They just had heard about it. And so it was kind of like an urban myth.
The other thing about it too that you have to remember is that, yeah, I think that's true in so many communities all over the earth, that when you shine a light on any of these superstitions and expose them to things like logic and reason, uh, they fall apart so quickly. One of my favorites of those is, and I this was actually a superstition that people in England believed as late as the 19th century. And just gonna say it. It's the eggshell boat superstition, which is in my book because how could I not put it in there? And this is the idea that if you're eating hard-boiled eggs, God, this is so silly. Well, if you're eating eggs of any kind, look, I don't mean to call any of these silly. That's insensitive, but this one's silly. Okay. Even if your ancestors believed in this one, this is pretty great. So if you're eating eggs, you've got to dispose of the eggshells by crumbling them up into a fine powder and not leaving any of the eggshells standing because if you and intact, because if you do, a witch will come and take those eggshells and build a life-size boat out of them and then come to your house and do terrible things to you. Now, if she's this makes no sense because if she's already close enough to you proximity-wise to crush up to use the eggshells for nefarious purposes, why doesn't she just kill you right then and there? Why does she need to then build a boat, go away to where she lives, and come back and do horrible cast a spell on you or murder you or whatever? She's already there to take the eggshells. I guess the idea is that if you dispose of them and then the garbage people come and, and they take out the trash, they put them in the trash compactor, and then she gets them from the landfill site or whatever. I don't know. But if you just expose that to like logic for like a second, it just falls apart completely. And yet these are things that there's a lot that when I was talking to my editor on this book and she's like, but how does this make sense? And I'm like, I don't know, but it's something that people used to believe, you know? And that's true of a lot of superstitions.
So many of the superstitions that persist today, usually in modified form, have Egyptian, Greek, or Roman origins. Why is that?
I think it's because a lot of them come to us from the ancient world, and what's fascinating to me about this is just that they've survived so long. When I was writing the book on myths and legends, it's kind of an open and shut case because a lot of these myths and legends, nobody believes in them anymore. Just nobody does. Nobody, you have to look really far to find people, everyone likes the Thor character in the Marvel movies and the Marvel comic books. But no one actually believes in Thor, the Norse god of thunder. Some people do. I did some speaking engagements in Trondheim in Norway in the 2010s. And I was asking some of the people at the venue, some of the people who brought me over there to speak. Does anyone, I was like, I know this is probably a stupid American question, but does anyone in Norway actually still believe in the ancient Norse gods? And they were like, some people, but they kind of live in the forest and we don't really talk to them. And so like it's very much like a fringe belief now that very few people, and if anyone believes in. But with these superstitions, what's fascinating to me is that even though they come to us from thousands and thousands of years ago, they've somehow survived. Um, and in fact, the word superstition comes from the Latin phrase superstes, which means I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is means to outlive or to live beyond. So it's the idea is that it's a belief that's lived beyond the society that used to practice it. Um, and so that's kind of derogatory, I think, because so the whole term superstition is a bit derogatory and condescending because it means that these are rituals or practices that have outlived their usefulness, that have become obsolete. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's kind of the opposite because, again, they've been handed down generation to generation, and there's a power in that and a strength in that like they're still around, even though they were first practiced by the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Romans. And I think there's something fascinating about that like we can't let those things go.
One of my favorite examples from the book along those lines is the umbrella thing, where you don't keep a umbrella open indoors.
Well, you don't have an umbrella open indoors, and a lot of people mistakenly think that that's because, oh, well, um, you're inviting the rain indoors with you or something like that. But what it really is that in ancient Egypt, they thought that, the privileged class, the nobility, used umbrellas outside for the same reason that British people did in the 19th century in the aristocracy in England, which is to ward off the sun, to shield yourself from the harmful rays of the sun, even though everyone was very much used to living with the sun beating down on you in ancient Egypt, and that's why they started believing in that the sun was really the god Ra, because it was ever present, it was always beating down on you in ancient Egypt. Very hot country. So this was a way to not have the rays of the sun beating down on you quite so harshly. Have an umbrella. If you're bringing the umbrella indoors and you're an ancient Egyptian culture, uh, that was bad because it's like you're mocking the god Ra. It's like you're mocking the sun. You're not using it for its proper intended purpose, the umbrella, I mean. And so then it was thought of as a bad luck symbol. So again, the fact that it survived thousands of years later, we're talking about it now in 2026 AD, you know what I mean, is kind of astonishing. And that people are still like, even though they don't know why it's bad luck, they're like, oh yeah, it's bad. You don't want to do that. You're not supposed to do that.
You write that the stereotypical Halloween witch began as a pagan goddess and was later demonized by the Christian church. What's that all about?
This was a superstition that came about, or a stereotype, I guess, about witches that started to come about when Christianity was sweeping through Europe in the Middle Ages. Basically, that witches until then, in Europe anyway, were thought of as these powerful healers and heroes, these heroic people. They were people who gave you medicine when you were sick. They were people who often led communities. They were leaders, They were good. They were thought of as good people, and they certainly were not depicted with green faces and warts and, ugly and gnarled and everything. Um, they were depicted as being very strong and very powerful and very beautiful often. And but that's the way they were depicted in Celtic communities and pre-Christian pagan communities. And so once Christianity started sweeping through Europe, the image of the evil witch, the monstrous looking witch, started to prevail because a lot of these Christian leaders were trying to convince people to give up their pagan beliefs and convert to Christianity. And so a way to do that is, well, look at the symbol that you worship, that you hold these witches in high esteem. Well, you shouldn't, because they're terrible people. They're going to curse you. They're going to bewitch you. That's where the whole phrase bewitch that's where that word even comes from, and Halloween, our Halloween's holiday today, is taken from two Celtic holidays. It's taken from All Hallows Eve a little bit, but it's largely taken from a festival called Samhain, which is spelled Samhain. It's spelled Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain. And one of the figures that would emerge, this was a harvest festival, around the same time of year that it is now. So like the end of the fall and the beginning of the winter. It's because that it's thought that during that time, the veil between our world and the world of the dead is at its flimsiest, and the ghosts and demons and monsters will slip through and walk among human beings during that time. But it's also, it was also a time for celebrating witches and for celebrating the power and the insight that they have and the way they're able to help these communities that they're a part of. And so, that's where once these communities became very disproportionately Christian, and the pagan members of these communities were either shamed or converted to Christianity. um, the image of the witch during that time of year changed drastically.
Throughout the book, you sprinkle in pop culture examples, like The Nightmare Before Christmas and Good Luck Chuck, to illustrate the persistence and acceptance of superstitions. Why is this important?
I think it's important because a lot of the imagery that we have in pop culture, especially in science fiction and fantasy and horror, comes from superstition. I mean, there's a long-running horror franchise called Friday the 13th, and the whole concept that Friday the 13th is bad luck. Even though that bad luck superstition doesn't really factor into those movies at all, the fact that they're called Friday the 13th means that something unlucky is going to happen to those kids at Camp Crystal Lake. You know, we know it's not something good that's gonna happen to them. And so, that's one way in which it's affected, popular culture. Also, there's a lot of celebrities that are superstitious, a lot of athletes, movie stars, comedians, um, actors are told not to they know there's an acting tradition in the theater, that you're not supposed to say the name Macbeth while you're performing in a production of Macbeth. You're supposed to call it the Scottish play because it's bad luck to say Macbeth.
Lest you continue in your quotation and mention the name of the Scottish play.
Oh, never fear, I shan't do that.
By the Scottish play, I assume you mean Macbeth.
Traitor, Wolfish stores, blood we may come in.
People in the performing arts, people in the sports world, writers, authors. Langston Hughes would write letters to people in green ink. They considered it good luck. Um, Taylor Swift considers the number 13 to be good luck because she's had only positive experiences with it. She's the number 13 has come up in all kinds of really positive ways for her throughout her life. So to her, it's a good luck symbol. And hey, to Jewish people, it's often a good luck symbol because bar and bat mitzvahs are often on the 13th year of a child's life. Sometimes it's 12th for bat mitzvahs, but often it's 13th as well. So, you know, and and a lot of this imagery, a lot of these rituals are used in pop culture in some way. Star Wars uses superstitions quite a bit because it's science fiction, but as George Lucas has said, it's also kind of science fantasy. You know, for a science fiction series, well, there's a lot of witches and ghosts in Star Wars. There's a lot of things for which there's no rational explanation. They're just supernatural. They're just from the occult world. There's no scientific rationale for them. It's not like robots and clones where they're science based. You know, and there's things that you find in superstitions quite a bit in Star Wars. In Empire Strikes Back, there's an evil cave. In a few different Star Wars movies, Han Solo has good luck pair of dice that he hangs in the Millennium Falcon. You know, came up a couple of times in the sequel trilogy, the Star Wars and trilogy, and in the Han Solo spin-off movie, Solo: A Star Wars Story. So, those characters are plenty superstitious.
What can we learn about ourselves and the world around us by exploring curious rituals and superstitions?
I think we can learn, first of all, that a lot of us are more superstitious than we were willing to admit. We can learn The fact that a lot of these things that, like I was saying earlier, that we consider to be just everyday ordinary things that have some basis in superstition. A good example, I mentioned weddings earlier, and there's a couple of really obvious examples of this. Well, they're obvious to me because I wrote the book, but they might not be obvious to you watching this. Um, One of them is you put a veil over the bride's face over until a certain point in the wedding ceremony. Well, that was originally done in a lot of communities to confuse demons and ghosts who might be haunting the ceremony so that they wouldn't notice that the woman with the veil over her face is the bride, and then do horrible things to her. It's the whole reason that you have bridesmaids. You have bridesmaids to confuse these evil forces so that they will, oh wait, maybe the bride is this woman. Oh no, maybe it's this woman. Oh, maybe it's this woman. There's all this stuff to confuse monsters. Confusing monsters is big in superstition. I think I talk about this in the book, but the Count character in Sesame Street has its roots in there's a pop culture related superstitious character, sort of, because it's the idea that the Count likes to count things. I mean, it's obviously a pun. It's a play on Count is in Count Dracula, and also count is in counting things. So then it's the pun for educating children about counting, about basic math skills. But a lot of people think that it might be because in a lot of European communities, hundreds of years ago, it was very common superstition to put grains of rice or seeds on the ground if you were next to a graveyard, because then what would happen is if a vampire came up from under the ground and it was going to chase after you, the vampire would then pause or chasing you and count the grains of rice or the grains of whatever, because that's what vampires do. We all know that. You guys know that, right? Be funny if we put that into an actual vampire movie, like a scary horror movie, as a way to confuse the vampire. I'm kind of amazed no one's done that at this point. That's where that comes from, I think. I would be surprised if it didn't, because it's just too much of a coincidence. One of the Sesame Street writers probably knew about that superstition, I'm guessing.
You're always busy. What have you got next in the hopper?
I'm still writing the 96 pack series for Penguin Random House. At the time of recording, the most recent 96 Facts book is 96 Facts about Chapel Roan. I've written a number of these books so far. 96 Facts about Taylor Swift was the inaugural volume in that series. And it made me a USA Today bestselling author because it sold incredibly well. Since then, I've written 96 Facts about Timothée Chalamet, 96 Facts about Beyonce, 96 Facts about Billie Eilish, 96 Facts about, Bad Bunny, a number of these, 96 Facts about BTS, and 96 Facts about Olivia Rodrigo, and we got the Chapel Roan one right here. Soon I'm going to have, for the last several years, I've been writing many of the Little Golden books for Penguin Random House, and the latest one that I've written is called The Day of Doom. This is a children's book, so that's coming out in May. Day of Doom, Little Golden book, and featuring the Avengers, featuring Dr. Doom. Also, I am a writer and narrative designer on an upcoming video game called Shadows of Dawn. It's a first-person shooter with RPG elements. I can't say a ton about it right now in terms of the plot and that sort of thing, but as soon as I can, I'll be posting some stuff on my website on ariekaplan.com. I wrote The Bad Guys Joke Book for Scholastic, and that's out now as well. A really fun book to write. It's based on the Bad Guys animated movies and Netflix specials, not the Bad Guys books by Aaron Blabey.
We'll keep an eye out for all of that. Thanks so much, Arie, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Joey. Thanks, Mike. It was great talking to all of you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.